All right, everybody. It looks like it's time. Let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Glad that you could be here for another edition of our program. My name is Chris Smith, and I am the coordinator for current science programming here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. It's good to be with you all for another lecture in our program. Every Wednesday at noon, we gather right here at the museum's YouTube channel around the glow of our screens in order to meet interesting people doing interesting things out there in the worlds of science, nature, art, education, and more. And today is going to be no different. For the month of April, we are celebrating Earth Month. The North Carolina Office of Environmental Education actually organizes and coordinates this lecture series. And for this entire month, they've assembled just an incredible list of guest speakers to be on the program to give us insights into the past, present, and future for planet Earth. So make sure that you mark your calendars and come and join us here at noon Eastern every Wednesday to hear from and learn from these really interesting and exciting people. For today's program, I'm very excited because, the most interesting and the most exciting people are the people who are associated with the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. I am biased, and I'm pretty sure they do pay me to say that. And today, of course, we have somebody who, although it looks like they're joining us from home, they work pretty close to where I happen to be sitting right now inside the museum, and that is Dr. Elizabeth Jones. Dr. Jones is the coordinator for the museum's Cretaceous Creatures program and is a postdoctoral researcher in our Paleontology research lab. Maybe most importantly for today, Dr. Elizabeth Jones has just recently released a brand new book, Ancient DNA, The Making of a Celebrity Science. Elizabeth, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Glad you could be here. I'm excited to learn more about your book. That's very exciting. Was it fun to sit down and write a book about paleontology and DNA?
Yeah, it was fun is one interesting word you could use to describe the process of writing a book. It was the research aspect of it was incredibly fun because as a historian of science, I get to study the people who study the fossils. And the people that I got to talk to and actually work really closely with are just as incredible as the fossils that they study.
Excellent. I love that. Well, I'll turn the program and the viewers over to you. Folks, remember that for the program, type your questions in the chat as we go along. We'll have a Q&A after the presentation. But from now until then, Dr. Jones, they're all yours.
Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that okay?
Looks good.
All right. Thank you so much. So like Chris said, I work at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, but I am actually at home right now because fun fact about the museum is that the office that I work in, you can actually see me. You can see everything I do because the Paleontology Research Lab is a public space. All of the walls are glass, so you as the public can look in and see what some of our preparators are preparing, what kind of dinosaur fossils they're working on. You can see our student researchers and what kind of new research they're producing. You can also see our volunteers and be one of those volunteers working in the lab. So I'm at home where it's a little bit more private, a little bit more quiet for today. But what I want to talk to you about specifically is ancient DNA and the research that went into this new book that I have written that was just released maybe a couple weeks ago. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to address and answer 3 specific questions for you. The first one is, what is ancient DNA research? The second one is, what is celebrity science? And the third one, the question that most people want to know the answer to, which I'm leaving for the very end, is, can we resurrect a dinosaur? So first things first, what is ancient DNA research? Well, in this book, I describe ancient DNA research as the practice of extracting, sequencing, and analyzing DNA from long dead organisms. Ancient DNA has been recovered from plants and animals and humans and bacteria, and it can be preserved in skin, tissues, and even bone if it's not a fully mineralized fossil. Now, ancient DNA can also be extracted from remains that are hundreds to thousands or hundreds of thousands of years old, or even millions of years old. Now, ancient DNA is tricky because over time, DNA degrades and it becomes damaged. It also becomes very easily contaminated through exposure to other DNA from the environment or from humans touching the specimens, whether in the field or in the lab. So given this, scientists in search of ancient DNA often have a pretty hard time finding it and making sense of it. So I want you to think of a genome, an organism's genome, its entire genetic makeup, as a book. And scientists want to find and read the entire genome or the whole book, so that way they can learn as much as possible about an ancient organism. Now, imagine that the pages of this book have all been torn out, probably not neatly ordered like this. And then imagine that they're put through a shredder. And then imagine that all these pieces of shredded paper have been thrown into the air. And it is the job of the scientist to put it all back together again. And it's not an easy job because with ancient DNA, only a few pages or even a few lines or letters of the book can be preserved over time. So to do ancient DNA research, you really need a lot of resources. So first you need ancient material, like the remains of a woolly mammoth, for example. But you also need that material to be in an ideal condition to have preserved DNA in the first place. On top of that, you need reliable technology to extract, sequence, and make sense of the DNA. So that way you can tell something interesting about its evolutionary history. And then you also need people to do all of this. And in particular, you need people with knowledge of and experience working with really ancient DNA. And like most anything in the world, you also need money. So to give you a little bit more context, I'm going to show you some iconic specimens from which scientists have tried to extract DNA from over the last 40 years. So this is the quagga, who went extinct about 150 years ago. And this is one of the very first creatures that DNA was extracted from in the early 1980s. So when we're talking about the history of ancient DNA research, I'm talking about work that is being done in the 1980s and then through today. We also have the thylacine, who went extinct about 100 years ago. DNA has also been extracted from mammoths, and this is an example of a frozen baby mammoth from Siberia. And Neanderthals, our ancient ancestors. And of course, insects preserved in amber, just like in Jurassic Park. So this brings us to our second question. What is celebrity science? Now, I'm not a scientist, and even though I work very closely with them, I'm actually a historian of science. And like I mentioned earlier, I study the people who study the fossils. And it's my job to take you behind the scenes of how science happens, what gets discovered, and who gets to discover it. So for this book, I use traditional historical research methods. Like I went to the archives, I read a lot of scientific papers, read a lot of media reports, read a lot of books. But I also got to interview over 50 scientists from over a dozen countries who actually work in the field of ancient DNA research. And I used oral history methods to help use their memories of working in this field, this new pioneering field, to write a history of how it all came to be, how it evolved from something that was once thought to be a little bit science fiction into a scientific reality. In doing so, what I found is that public interest and the media spotlight really played a key role in the new field's development. And in particular, it was this public's interest in using ancient DNA to resurrect extinct organisms, from dinosaurs to mammoths. In fact, over the decades, ancient DNA research has grown into much more than a public-facing science. I argue in this book that it's grown into what I call a celebrity science. So here are a few key points about what I argue a celebrity science is. And feel free in the Q&A to ask me more questions about it. But I suggest that a celebrity science is a subject of science that exists and evolves under intense public interest and extreme media exposure. So while the media presents scientists working in and around this field of interest with opportunities for publicity, scientists are also pragmatic in making their own occasions for public notice. Overall, a celebrity science is really a process and a product of consistent science media interactions around the subject of science over an extended period of time. Now, there are a number of instances of this interplay between science and media, here in the history of ancient DNA research, but also throughout the history of science and other subject areas. But the most illustrative example that I'm going to talk to you about today is none other than the example of Jurassic Park. So following Michael Crichton's 1990 publication of the book Jurassic Park, two research teams in the US, one in California and the other in New York, set out to try to extract and sequence multi-million-year-old DNA from amber insects. In 1993, one of the teams from California claimed to have recovered DNA from a 135 million-year-old amber-encased weevil, and they announced it as the oldest DNA ever recovered. The journal Nature published the paper on June 10, 1993. And this was one day after the Jurassic Park movie premiere and one day before its release in theaters across the United States. So media outlets, as well as researchers, took notice of the timing. And one scientist that I interviewed had some pretty negative remarks to make about it all. This scientist told me this: "I thought it absolutely extraordinary that a scientific journal, there was no way it was a coincidence, that a prestigious scientific journal like Nature would hold on to an article to wait for the opening day of a movie. Of course, it caused a huge media splash." However, given that Nature was and is a popular and commercial journal, in addition to a scientific one, it's really not unreasonable nor unexpected that a journal would take advantage of this opportunity. And this isn't the only instance in which something like this has happened. But what I want to note here is that what's interesting is that this interviewee's perception of the timing reflects a more general feeling sometimes across scientists who view popular outward influences on science as potentially damaging to the integrity of the science. And this is a tension that researchers working within the celebrity science of ancient DNA research would have to wrestle with again and again. Now, Jurassic Park's popularity also played a role in grant funding. For example, in 1993, Jack Horner, a paleontologist and a scientific consultant to Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park films, applied for a grant through the National Science Foundation in the US to search for DNA in dinosaur bone, which, spoiler alert, they didn't find. But the NSF funded the grant this same summer that the Jurassic Park movie was released. And according to one of the practitioners involved in the research, the correlation between the funds and the film weren't really a coincidence. "It's hard to get money," this interviewee said. "I think NSF gave us money at that time just because of the movie. It was the perfect time for it." Jurassic Park also played a significant role in setting research agendas and influencing professional recruitment. In the mid to late 1990s, for example, there was a research team at the Natural History Museum in London, and they set out to test the validity of a series of studies that had claimed to extract multi-million-year-old DNA from amber. When researchers said this, "The job that I got was all down to Jurassic Park. The museum probably would never have gotten the funding to try to do this if it hadn't been for Jurassic Park in the first place. So part of my kind of entry into this ancient DNA world was due to a movie." Now, in the end, researchers debunked the Jurassic Park hypothesis, explaining that they'd failed in their attempts to recover DNA from really ancient amber fossils. And this finding, along with a host of other studies that challenged the recovery of extremely ancient DNA, led to a dramatic drop in both the public and professional confidence in the field's credibility. In response, two ancient DNA researchers wrote a now infamous paper published in Science titled Ancient DNA, Do It Right or Not at All. In this article, they argued for the adoption of 9 key criteria for doing ancient DNA in order to avoid issues of contamination or to avoid issues of not being able to reproduce certain results reliably. They even argued that editors and reviewers for high-profile journals continued to publish work without proper protocols. So they were partly blaming them for failing to enforce criteria that would help legitimize the practice, which was especially important when it was just getting its start in the 1990s. So what we see actually over the next several years and even decades is that scientists found they were responding to 2 types of contamination. So I argue that they were responding to more than just the literal problem of contamination, which refers to the potential exposure of other DNA from the environment, bacteria, or even humans to an ancient sample. This question of ancient DNA authenticity was a real problem for scientists, especially in the early days, because to have authentic ancient DNA really mattered because it was a prerequisite for credibility. And this mattered for the success of the practice and the reputation of the scientists working within it. At the same time, however, some scientists viewed the hype around the search for DNA from fossils as a further and a more figurative source of contamination, but one that was no less real. According to some scientists, disproportionate or undeserved media interest or influence, especially at a time when the stakes were really high for the young field, had an adverse effect of contaminating the field's credibility. Now, it's important to note that although we see some of these negative consequences coming out of some of this media attention on the science, overall, the celebrity influence was critical to the field's development, and overall, I argue, was a positive influence. What we see is that celebrity really is complicated, and we have to look at the nuance of it. However, we see that media attention was perceived to challenge the young field, and also we see that media attention empowered it at the same time. It was a give and take over a number of years. First, celebrity influenced the community's initial formation. Jurassic Park and the whole franchise that followed it really provided momentum behind this emerging practice. And in a way, it was a survival strategy for scientists at a time when success was not necessarily given. So the preservation and extraction of DNA from fossils had never been done and had never been demonstrated reliably, and so it had to first be shown. And obtaining press and public and institutional support was important in doing so. As this one researcher said, I think media played a huge role in ancient DNA. If you think about it, ancient DNA started off as this thing that was crazy. We didn't have the methods, we didn't have the know-how, and we needed that tie in order to generate interest and funding until we got to that point to see what they could do and also what could be done. Second, celebrity played a really key role in ancient DNA researchers over identity as a field. Ancient DNA essentially became a brand, and under this new name, the corresponding conferences and newsletters and publications and headlines, as well as grants, gave meaning to what was at first a far-fetched idea. And I want to argue too that branding is not superficial. It's really purposeful and pragmatic and even necessary. As this researcher told me, it's good to have a brand that people can recognize to show that what you do is different from other fields. Now, finally, the question you've probably all been waiting for is, can we resurrect a dinosaur? And the short answer to this is no, because we do not have dinosaur DNA. And if we did, we likely would not have a good quantity or quality of it in order to achieve such a big task. But here's the thing. Scientists who have any association with the search for DNA from fossils always get asked this one question: can we bring back a dinosaur? And there is a valid historical reason for it, given this cultural connection between the field and the popular depictions of it, like in Jurassic Park. Interestingly, the majority of ancient DNA researchers have very little or even nothing to do with de-extinction, which is this idea and this science and a new research area behind reviving extinct species. There are really only a handful of researchers who are pursuing such efforts, and there are a number of approaches that can be taken along the way. They're from backbreeding, as in the case of the quagga, to cloning, as in the case of the thylacine, and to genome editing, as in the case of the passenger pigeon. But what the history of ancient DNA research shows us is that you don't know if you don't try. And over the last 10 years, there have been significant technological advancements that have made this idea of resurrecting extinct species even more plausible. The expectations for species revival have really shifted to what scientists are now calling Pleistocene Park. And some of the researchers behind these efforts are interested in more than just bringing back what has gone extinct as far as an organism. They want to recreate the environment in which the animals and the fauna lived. In order to recreate the subarctic grassland ecosystem that existed tens of thousands of years ago, some researchers in Siberia are trying to recreate Pleistocene Park, and this involves bringing back the mammoth as a crucial organism to help recreate and maintain that environment. From this view, some researchers are arguing that de-extinction is a sort of rewilding, and you can think of it as conservation biology with a twist. But for the most part, what I find in my research and what I presented in the book is that ancient DNA researchers themselves as a community are really critical or at least skeptical of de-extinction efforts. And they often have derogatory interpretations of it that might seem difficult to reconcile with this overall positive influence that celebrity has had, specifically related to Jurassic Park, on the whole of the field, in order to get it from an idea that started with very little interest and backing into a fully fledged research field today. Many researchers involved in de-extinction efforts, or who speak in favor of it, such as Michael Archer, who ran the thylacine cloning project, or Ben Novak, who currently runs the passenger pigeon project, often face intense criticism. And anyone doing something new, or especially something unimaginable, is going to have a long road to walk and a fine line to walk between science and celebrity. And the history of ancient DNA research gives some explanation for why that road is so long and why that line is so thin to walk. But it also suggests that it is worth attempting. So what's the overall take-home message from this talk today? Although I only highlighted a few examples, what the book shows is that throughout the history of ancient DNA research, media influence was not limited to a single time or a place or an event or an issue or even an individual scientist. Rather, the media's influence was ongoing and to the point that the whole discipline was shaped by it from the 1980s even to today. And given the history outlined in this book, celebrity is likely to be a part of the field's future, especially as this science-media connection continues to develop into a more powerful and pervasive phenomenon in the 21st century. And thank you so much for your attention. I welcome any questions you may have.
All right, everybody. Let's, how about a great big virtual round of applause for Dr. Elizabeth Jones. Very interesting stuff. Lots of thought-provoking issues. It's in this presentation, and it sounds like in the book as well. so many celebrity sciences that I see in the news and in media, and that seem to get top billing in like big prestigious science journals, seem to be, ones that these days are controversial, like, or maybe I should put controversial in quotes, but things like de-extinction, or you mentioned gene editing as a great one that, ethicists and biologists and geneticists all are debating these topics at once. Do you think that, and a question that I'll start with here while I give a moment for the audience to type theirs up. Do you think that, did ancient DNA sort of begin this modern trend of science and media interactions going back and forth? And well, I'll start there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So if you take the long view, looking at the history of science, no, ancient DNA really is not unique in this display of science and media interactions. What is unique is the intensity and consistency and duration in which it all played out, and continues to do so. And a lot of that has to do with movements in what we could call modern science. So science communication efforts, also celebrity culture, media culture, all of those things are, we can say, are relatively recent movements, and ancient DNA grew up along those. So, but to answer your question, so if you look at the history of paleontology, paleontologists have done a lot of work over the last 200 years to popularize science, the science of paleontology, and to popularize dinosaurs specifically. There's always been in the field of paleontology a very close connection between political and institutional support to the search for fossils. And that is not just unique to paleontology, but has been shared across the sciences. Space science is another great example. So what I hope that the book really kicks off a conversation about is for other researchers to look at other sciences that display similar characteristics, in order to not just label something as a celebrity science, but to use the term celebrity science as a framework for looking at the process of science, what gets done, how it gets done, and why.
And maybe get some help with funding for all of those great researches that are happening that it's difficult to in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did or does still the science in the field of ancient DNA benefit from maybe not being as, quote, controversial as something like CRISPR gene editing or de-extinction, since we've been mentioning those? Like maybe in the early 90s, ancient DNA and just checking to see if there's DNA in a fly in amber wasn't such a big deal compared to human genome editing.
Right. So if I think I understood you correctly, I think I would say two things to that. Is that anytime you have a new scientific idea or technology, it's inevitable that you have to go through the process of testing it out and finding the limits, or overcoming the limits that you think may be there. And it's what philosophers of science call, an anomaly. So if you get DNA from a fossil, the first time that happened, people thought that's an anomaly. That shouldn't happen. And so what else could it be? And then can we find it again and from other fossils? And what's interesting about science is that, and particularly the public interest in it, is that we love things that are the oldest and the fastest and the first or the last. And that has been true of just how the media reports, for better or worse. That is subject to other people's opinions, but that is the way that we like to think and talk about the world. And scientists love that too, because that's exciting. That's the process of discovery. But at the same time, scientists also want things to become commonplace, because when it's common, it's reliable. And when it's reliable, you can find out consistent information and learn more and be more confident in the way the world is, or the way the world was, and what we can know about it. So it's always that tension between something new, but also something known.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Well, I'm going to look down here and see what the audience is thinking about too now. Thanks for taking my questions. Okay, Mary writes, do you discuss archaeogenetics within an archaeological rather than a paleontological context within the book? Excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much. And that is a fantastic question. Thank you very much for that. So how I approached the overall topic of ancient DNA research for this book was with a broad view of ancient DNA research and evolutionary biology in general. So the people that I talked to and the papers that I read, and the labs that I visited, they do archaeology, paleontology, botany, epidemiology, kind of the whole thing. And there has been some other fantastic scholarship that looks at archaeogenetics and ancient DNA research, specifically on ancient humans. And that is a fascinating and an extremely complicated area of research that I do touch on in this book, but that I do not get into extreme detail. I think the most important thing that I cover in that area of human evolution would be, of course, the Neanderthal genome and the extreme feat of resources that needed to come together on a pretty quick timeline in order to recover enough DNA in order to produce the Neanderthal genome. And what's really interesting that's been interesting and extremely controversial in the field of ancient DNA research around humans is the difficulty disentangling, if it can be done, cultural drivers of human evolution with genetic drivers of evolution, and also in line with like the morphological, so the fossil evidence. So I do touch on that some in the book, but I have other scholars. There are other colleagues that are scholars that specialize in that. That's a great question. Thank you.
And there was a follow-up to that one from another viewer. Where do you draw the line between archaeogenetics and ancient DNA, especially when it comes to human population genetics? Is there a line?
Yeah, another very hard question that I am not going to be able to answer. And if I'm understanding it correctly, if you're talking about like temporal boundaries, that's the jury's still out for that, at least from all of the interviewees that I spoke with. I do know that if you want to talk about the social aspect of the science, that the researchers working in ancient human evolution, they amongst themselves have either implicitly, sometimes explicitly, kind of demarcated certain boundaries of how far back in time they, as their research lab, are allowed to study certain specimens or certain fossils. So you have some research groups that do only Neanderthals, not only Neanderthals, but they're the only lab that can touch Neanderthals. You have some other research groups that specialize in Neolithic era and looking at things like lactase persistence in humans and agricultural developments and just different time periods. So there you do see some demarcation of the temporal boundaries, but that's amongst the scientists and what they go out and study. But as far as how old something counts as archaeogenetics, I couldn't tell you. I think that would be a better question directed to some of the researchers themselves.
Excellent. Excellent stuff. All right, let's see. The next one I've got here comes from David. Let's see. Do you know anything more about the recent news of dinosaur fossils found in North Dakota believed to have died as a direct result of the meteorite impact? Talking about some celebrity science and media connections.
Yeah, you know, I am ignorant. I have read the headline. I have not read the article, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I saw the headlines and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I haven't investigated it any further yet. Besides that, I saw a story, a paleontology story that came out the same week, was that the paleontologists had found a nearly perfectly preserved nest of eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And so a commenter on the internet, of which there are many, found it ironic that the meteorite impact absolutely devastated, buried, and killed this dinosaur in violence, and also perfectly preserved in grace and beauty, untouched, delicate eggs. Interesting. I thought that was a fun take. I wish I could credit them for it. I forgot they're using it.
Well, I love that, and I think that goes to show that really both two things can be true, you know.
Exactly.
And true with a little t, maybe not a big T. Yeah, I mean, and that is the fascinating thing, that some things are so rare and unique, but also, you know, some things are not at all, and just that balance between it.
I love it. All right, next question for you here. During your research, did you look at any older examples of popular culture or celebrity influencing science, such as Jules Verne or even the original Star Trek series?
I did not for this book. One of my good colleagues, David Kirby, you all should check out his book. It's called Lab Coats in Hollywood. And he does a phenomenal job of taking lots of different subjects of science that have been have very close ties to Hollywood blockbusters, or so thinking of Galactica and E.T. and of course Jurassic Park, and he explores those in detail. So I would point you in that direction. But what that work and what those examples that the person who asked the question mentioned, that was all important and inspiring me to want to investigate just what this connection might have looked like in this field and why, and then how it may be different.
Excellent answer. So how many times did you have to watch Jurassic Park to write this book?
This is a good question. So, you know, the first time I watched Jurassic Park, I was 7, and it was scary, so I didn't finish it. And the next time I watched Jurassic Park was embarrassingly when I was a master's student, and I started work and in the history of ancient DNA research, and I thought, well, I guess it's about time. So I watched it and all the other movies. And I think there's a 4th one coming out, of course, in June.
It sounds like a good time to publish a book on ancient DNA.
I know, you know, I really wanted to, I was going to see if I could get my editor to wait to publish it with the release of the movie, but it wasn't in the cards, so.
just follow that same playbook
as
Nature in 1994, right? Let's see. One of our viewers says they've watched Jurassic Park, I guess at least 40 times.
Wow.
But I don't know if they've written a book about it. So,
Hey, you should.
Connect some dots for me between your work or the work that you're engaged in here at the museum with our paleontology research team and efforts like this science history work that you do.
Yeah, that is a great question. And so connecting the dots between this book and what I do. So this book is really a story. It's about ancient DNA, but it's a story about the intersections of science, media, the public, how science works. And as a historian, looking at those places of intersection that are often a bit messy is what really motivates me. And my work here at the museum is I'm very lucky in that I get to actually bring the public into science and bring science to the public, because I am the project coordinator for Cretaceous creatures, which is a part of the Dueling Dinosaurs program that's part of the lab that'll be kicked off in about a year. And what we're doing is we're engaging 8th grade science teachers and students across North Carolina in making their very own microfossil discoveries. So we're bringing, our team of paleontologists at the lab has brought hundreds of pounds of sediment, so dirt, from Montana, and some of the same formation where the dueling dinosaurs themselves were found. And this dirt is really cool because it's about 66, 67 million years old. And they brought it from Montana back to the lab, and we're creating kits that we're going to send out to classrooms across North Carolina. And the students themselves are going to be able to search through it for microfossils, which means they're really small fossils like bones, teeth, shells, and scales. And they're going to help identify the fossils and send the data back to the museum, and it'll be part of our museum collection. And that's really cool because that is a citizen science effort. And what I like about that is that it's that intersection of what is science and what is the public. And what you see is that those lines are sometimes, I don't want to say arbitrary, but they can be blurred. And citizen science is an opportunity to bring those two seemingly disparate worlds together and create new scientific knowledge that probably wouldn't get created without the public's involvement. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's part of it.
Oh yeah, that absolutely answers my question. Bringing the public and science together in order to advance knowledge and make new discoveries, making it all more of one thing instead of two entirely separate, pretending that it's two entirely separate things.
I like that. Yeah, exactly. I'll have to remember that one, Chris. Yeah.
So let's see here. One of our viewers, we're still talking about Jurassic Park in the chat. They haven't written a book about it, but they were a guest on the Jurassic Park Minute podcast. Jans Koch,
Cool.
Who used to be a part of the Paleo Lab here at the museum.
Awesome. Would love to chat with you more.
Interesting stuff. So I guess looking at the clock and our questions, one of the last things that I would ask you is, what was the process like for pulling all of this together for you? Like, I think I kind of opened with this at the beginning, but doing the interviews and the research and pulling it all together and trying to tell this story, like, what are some of the, like, what's the key insight on this connection between celebrity science and what it means for, say, practicing researchers in the field?
Yeah, so the key insight is this new term, celebrity science. So any researcher, me included, who is trying to present something new. You have to articulate sometimes something new. And celebrity science was the concept that I chose to articulate. Of course, I had my supervisors, my colleagues were instrumental, and the researchers themselves were instrumental in making sure that this was an appropriate term. And by appropriate, meaning that the evidence supported it. So the evidence from the interviewees themselves, but also from the historical documents and the publications, and connecting all those dots. And celebrity science was a difficult term to select because celebrity carries a lot of baggage. As a term, it's often used in the pejorative sense. It's derogatory. It's used to denote something that's superficial or doesn't really have much substance to it and shouldn't be taken seriously. And as a historian, I do not pass judgment on the studies themselves for the validity of the claims. But as a historian of science who is using this term celebrity science to categorize an entire research field, I do own, and I make it clear in the book, that this is a positive phenomenon in my view, despite the negative interpretations that some scientists have had about certain events or issues. But what you see is that if you don't take this superficial view of celebrity, it allows you to actually look at the complexity of how science works and appreciate the nuance that is involved in it. So if you have a short-sighted view of celebrity, you're going to come down and think that this is an inappropriate term to describe what goes on in science. But if you take that holistic view, you'll see that yes, there are perceived positive and negative consequences, but overall, the scientists working in ancient DNA research are risk takers, and they're charismatic, and they're competitive, they're interesting, they're weird, they're brilliant, and they're really savvy at understanding the world in which science operates and using all available resources in order to make really new and important discoveries. And again, like I said, you don't know if you don't try. And ancient DNA researchers are always balancing between what can we try, and in a way that maintains their credibility as researchers, but also keeps them relevant to the public. And I think that was the hardest thing about writing this book, is putting a name to something that happens in ancient DNA research, but happens in other sciences, but presenting it in a way, and trying to, in a way that wouldn't alienate people, and in particular, the scientists that helped me write this. And I know some of them are not happy with my portrayal, but I know, and I checked with many of them before this book ever came to be, to make sure that what I presented was true of their experiences, whether they really liked it or not. That was the hardest part of bringing it all together.
Well, excellence, just awesome stuff. Tell folks where they can follow you for updates about your research, the book, and maybe elsewhere or other things.
Okay. So you can follow me on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, at Dr. Dino DNA, which, by the way, we don't have Dino DNA, but ancient DNA research has a lot of other cool stuff to show you. And you can buy the book online, major retailers like Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I think the museum bookstore is going to be getting some hard copies too. So if you're at the museum, come by, visit our bookstore. It's amazing, and grab a book there as well.
All right. The book was Ancient DNA, The Making of a Celebrity Science. Elizabeth, thanks for being on the program today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was great.
And hey, thanks to all of you folks for tuning in to today's program as well. We will be back here again next Wednesday with another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Next week, we're going to be hearing from folks from the North Carolina Museum of Art. They've just opened a new exhibit, and they're going to be talking fault lines, art, and the environment. Make sure that you tune in. Go ahead and mark your calendars to be with us next year. Of course, you can subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel, click the bell to get notified when we go live. That way you'll get the notification and you can come and join us next week for that program when we get started. I would love to see you all here again one more time, if not every single week. And of course, you can read up about next week's program and see future upcoming speakers and descriptions for the talks at the museum's website, naturalsciences.org. We tend to post about them on social media as well. We're at Natural Sciences on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can and should, if you like this kind of stuff, follow the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education. They are always on Twitter, sharing the best nature stuff from all across the state. They're at North Carolina EE on Twitter and on Facebook. And their website, ee.northcarolina.org, has more information as well. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Remember, take care, stay safe, do your part to keep your community safe, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.